Well, Anne, thanks again for agreeing to sit with us and talk with us.
And I want to thank you
Oh,
for getting me to do this, because I have finally got some of my personal history together in one place, which I've been promising my daughters I would do for about 30 years. They are very happy with you.
excellent. Well, I'm glad. I thought we could begin at the beginning, and I know that you were born in Chicago
Right.
in 1933, and I was just wondering on what day you were born and what your given name was.
Well, I was born on April 20th, and my name is Ann Carroll. And that you spell Carroll, A-N-N-C-A-R-Y-L.
And you grew up in Evanston, Illinois, is
Yeah,
that
we moved to
correct?
Evanston when I was 5, so I could go to kindergarten in Evanston schools,
And-
and stayed there until, well, my mother stayed there until she died. I left, but that worked.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about your family of origin, about your mother and your father and their family backgrounds?
They both grew up in Chicago, and they were both from very religious families, but their children didn't turn out to. But that influenced an enormous amount of their attitude, and you've probably read a little bit about my mother's attitudes on some things, and that was all from her very, very religious background.
Very conservative, I would describe it, about gender
Evangelical.
roles.
Sort of the right side of evangelical.
Okay.
I mean, this is really conservative in a way that we don't see it today. I mean, today's culture doesn't allow the conservatism that existed back then.
Were they part of these large kind of Baptist kind
They
of
were
revival
Methodists.
churches? Interesting.
They were Methodists, and but they just happened to believe in a very conservative flavor of Methodist.
And was that something that they shared with their parents and their extended family?
Well, my parents, my
Right.
grandparents, that's where they got the conservative from. My father's father was a minister in the church, and my grandmother on my mother's side was very active, in charge of the women's program, and traveled some for the Methodist Church for the women's program. So it was very intense.
Was there a community of their kind of co-religionists in Evanston? Was
No.
that part? No. So they were isolated
They
from that?
moved away from that. Now, my father got much less conservative, but my mother, to the extent she could, and raise 5 children and do all the other things that, in the 1930s and 40s, being a mother and working in a house was more than a full-time job. And I was the oldest of 5 kids, so she was really busy. And there were washing machines, took a lot of hand labor, and there were no dryers. And this is Evanston, where it freezes in the winter, so you have to run out in the middle of the day and bring in your clothes before they freeze on the drying line. So it's a full-time job. So she was very busy. And so when we all left home, then she went back and volunteered at the church and was part of the board of the local Methodist church. But in between, she was kind of too busy to be active.
Was that something that you as a girl were called upon to help your mother with, running the household?
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much. And I very much, there were years when I basically cooked the dinner every night because my mother was pregnant and not feeling like cooking dinner. And so it was, I was very much involved with raising the kids, which probably wasn't wouldn't have been my first choice of childhood, but it turned out it was great experience for being a manager. So
Interesting.
so later on, it turned out it wasn't so bad after all.
Well, before we lose that train of thought, could you talk about some of the ways in which helping raise your siblings gave you important lessons for being a manager?
Well, it helped being a manager, it helped raising children, and my own children, and you just learn how to have people who are at each other's throats, how to calm them down and talk to them until they can come to some compromise. And after you've done that 1,000 times, why, it begins to sink in what the routine is.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And is there any particular, is it a technique that you could describe, or is it kind of a tacit knowledge that you gain about how to?
You listen.
Hmm.
I think you listen. You just listen. Let them talk and talk and talk. And it turns out that if people talk long enough, they can figure out what the problem is.
So it's really allowing them to figure it out. Mm-hmm. That's very wise. Your father worked in advertising.
Yes.
Did he work in advertising in the city? Did he?
Yes,
commute
in Chicago.
Yeah.
He had his own business, his own company in Chicago. And, back in those days, most of the days, he took the train into Chicago. Transportation in those days was very good between Evanston and Chicago, and his office was close to the train station. So.
And was that mostly print advertising, or what sort of work was it?
Yeah. Lots of ads in the newspapers and magazines of the day and on the bulletin boards. Yeah.
Did that world of advertising that he was involved in, did that interest you, or did that touch your life very much at all?
Well, maybe we should step back. Before I was 5, I did a lot of modeling as a child. And I was very cute as a very little girl. And so I had a lot of experience with what it meant to be in the ads, and that meant I wasn't a natural for that. I didn't like sitting around all day while they spent 2 minutes taking your picture when they got around to it. So I was never attracted to being in advertising. And my mother didn't, as you probably know, believe that women should be in business. So letting my father take us to his office was just not in the cards.
Okay.
Now, I turned around and did the complete opposite. Both of my girls worked in my businesses. And it set them off so they could do their own thing. They knew what was coming, but that wasn't my mother's approach.
Was it your father who realized that you were so photogenic for your
No,
early
that was my mother.
Oh, she had realized that. Interesting. So that was okay.
They needed money.
Oh, right. As a practical matter.
Sell the daughter of the.
So that was when you were very young.
Very young.
Okay.
Yeah, before I was 5. After we
Okay.
moved to Evanston, it was all over.
And Evanston was, in part, you seem to be, I was hearing that it was for you to go to go to
school.
And the schools there
And
were very good
schools
because
were-
of the universities, et cetera?
I don't know why the schools were good, but they were very good schools for the day.
Okay.
And I'm sure there were a lot of influences, partly the professors, I'm sure, but they was just good schools. It's like moving to Palo Alto or something. It's just good schools.
Well, could you describe a bit of what your education was like before high school and in grade school and middle school, whatever those years?
Except for the fact that we didn't begin to learn now I'm watching my grandson go through school. He just got out of 2nd grade. He's going to be in 3rd grade. He's learning things in 2nd grade that we didn't get till. Some of the things he's learned in 2nd grade we didn't get till high school. They are just fabulous. Not only did he learn all this regular curriculum, he's now fluent in Spanish in addition.
Wow.
And I have to say, watching this is just like a miracle. And they obviously know how to do this if they put the money into it. He's in Mountain View School District. They obviously can take kids who know nothing and make them fluent in Spanish by the end of second grade, give them all this enormous background. I wish we would put the money into every school district. It's so sad. It's so great to watch him and so sad to talk to other people whose grandkids are not in such a good school district.
Right. But for you, yours was...
Mine was, it was a neighborhood school.
Okay.
We all walked to school. I'm still best friends with the girl who lived across the alley, and we walked to school together every day for 6 years. So they're thinking of having another high school reunion in the fall back in Evanston. So yeah, a lot of us have stayed good friends for many, many years, and it was that kind of community. It was so homogeneous. Now, there's downsides to that, but at the time it was great to be a very homogeneous community. Everybody was friendly.
And what was school like for you? Was it something that you liked, hated,
No,
thrived
it was fun.
at? Okay.
And school was fun, and and I had all these friends, and we got to walk home for lunch and go back to school. So at least half our day, even though we were in school, half our day was playing with our friends as we walked back and forth to school. So how can you beat that?
By the time you got to, let's say you're starting high school, schools and your neighborhood are obviously big parts of your daily routine. Were there other places like the athletics or the library, or were there other important places that you recall from those days?
Well, when we were all kids, younger, pre-high school, turned out we lived on a street with enormous front yards. I mean, they were big enough for another house. And so after school, everybody would come over and play baseball. So this was this was life in the 40s. Everybody, the whole neighborhood came over to play baseball every afternoon.
And was that, you shared that as a hobby, baseball? You enjoyed playing it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody pitched in.
And what was
And the Cubs, of course, was our favorite team, which they have never won, but they are still our favorite team.
Did you go and watch them play?
Occasionally.
Yeah. I was wondering what your family's experience, your family, and your community's experience of the war was like.
The war was very difficult. I mean, not nearly as difficult for us as it was for the Europeans. But it was difficult. There was only one day when the stores had any variety of food or laundry soap or soap of any kind or sugar, any of these things. That was Saturday morning. I used to go out and stand in line at 6:45 to be able to get a number to get into the store, because we had 5 kids to feed, and if you weren't there for an early number, there was nothing left.
Wow.
So now we all had what we called victory gardens, and so during the summer we had plenty of fresh veggies. And we learned a lot about gardening in those in those years. And of course, at the end of the summer, you spent weeks and weeks canning everything,
Right.
so you'd have something to eat all winter. It was very difficult. There was almost no fuel, so you couldn't drive a car anywhere. So my dad took the train because you couldn't drive a car that far. You couldn't, and that's very close. It's like driving from here to Palo Alto, and you couldn't waste that kind of fuel. There was no fuel. It was a very, personally it was a hard time. And then of course, as you walk to school every day. They had those flags, and I don't know if you're familiar with the flags they put in the windows.
I'm not.
They had flags in the window of every family that had a son in the military. And they would put blue stars on these flags as they went into the military. And the stars changed to gold if the son was killed.
Mm.
And so we would walk to school and worry every day about having one of the stars change to gold.
Mm.
It was traumatic the whole time.
Right, and it must, so how old, you were like 10 or something
Mm-hmm.
like that? Yeah, so a tough age for that,
A
you know,
tough age.
You're fully kind of aware of what's going on, but probably don't, yeah, I could imagine it was terrifying.
Yeah, it was a very difficult time for everybody. And of course, I'd come home for lunch and my mother would be listening to the news because everybody was terrified. One funny story about my conservative parents. One of the things you're not supposed to do if you're properly belonging to the church is talk to anyone except family members or church members if you're at church on Sunday.
Wow.
Now, it turns out that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning. And I was standing on our front porch when my neighbors came out, with whom I was friends, and said, "You've got to tell your mother they bombed Pearl Harbor." And I didn't know how to tell her because if I told her they had bombed Pearl Harbor, she would know I had talked to somebody who wasn't in the family. And I couldn't decide for which I would get more punishment.
Oh my goodness, what did you decide?
I went in the house and said, "Have you turned on the radio this morning, Mother?"
Good strategy.
And I walked over and said, "I'm curious to know what's on the radio this morning." So I didn't exactly have to admit anything.
Right.
But just to give you an idea of how conservative the
Yeah.
religion was, I mean, you can't even, I was afraid to tell her. And I knew she'd been listening to the news and worrying about this for, months and months. And so I knew she would want to know. But I couldn't, I was terrified of the punishment if I had talked to somebody outside the family on a Sunday.
So as a teenager going into the public high school, which I imagine must have been a sizable
Yeah.
school,
It was a big school.
how did I guess especially your mother, how did she approach the fact that you were going to be going into this, big environment if she had all these, beliefs about?
Well, the interesting thing about my mother, people are self-contradictory, okay?
That's for sure.
The interesting thing about my mother is that she had taught at that high school. So she knew, she was friends with many of the teachers who were there. And so she kind of encouraged me to get into this class or that class and get this teacher or that teacher. That would be conservative enough for her.
What had been her subject?
She's a math teacher.
Oh.
And she was a very good math teacher. Later on, many years later, I came home one time and she was teaching after my dad died. She went back to teach, and so I got a chance to sit in on her class one day. She was a phenomenal math teacher. But I asked her, and she loved teaching, and she was really good at it. And so I said, "Why did you stop teaching?" And she said, "I couldn't work while your dad was alive because it would have been such an embarrassment to him that his wife needed to work."
Oh.
So here we go with the conservative world again. So she had to give up her favorite occupation, the favorite thing she loved to do in all her life, the real meaning of her life, and she had to give it up to look proper in the community.
For how long then did she give up teaching?
Well, she gave it up when they got married, and or at least when we moved to Evanston, she
Right.
gave up. And he died when I was, I don't know, 25 or something. So 20 years.
Oh, okay. So sort of frustrating herself in a way by those strictures too.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely. It was, yeah.
Did she bring math into the household though?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk about that?
We did talk about math. And, yeah. And, I think all the kids have a good math background.
Was that something, I would imagine that was something that you enjoyed, that really you connected with in school and with your mom and in the...
Yeah. Always enjoyed math, never had a problem with it, always thought it was fun. And, I think my kids are the same and my grandson's the same. It's just sort of part of the way our family operates. You manage to explain fractions when they're trying to figure out how to do a recipe or something, and it's just automatic. It just becomes part of their life, and that's the way I grew up too. It's just every time we'd learn something new in school, like fractions, I already knew about it because it was just part of the family.
What did that go along with? It seems there are sometimes associations between mathematics and music in a household, or mathematics and puzzles. Were there any of these?
Oh, yeah.
Sort of. Could you talk about those?
Well, we had a really nice piano, really nice grand piano for virtually as long as we lived in Evanston, and we all got piano lessons. And my sister, I have less. We all played an instrument. I played the violin. My sister played the flute. She got good at it. I never got good at it. But puzzles and games and of that sort. They have much better examples of these things these days. So, but that was just the way it was. That was life. Yeah.
Well, could you tell us a bit then about how your experience in high school unfolded and what that was like for you in the classroom and outside of the classroom?
I was just like every other. I was just like all of my friends from grade school. We were all together. Back in those days, they had groups called Y clubs from the YMCA, or pretty much like our Y over here. Organized groups, and so they had Y clubs for girls and Y clubs for boys, and so we just we all managed to maintain the same friendships all through high school, and it just went along like that. In the summer, we'd all had this good education. We'd all gone to some of the best. My friends had gone to some of the best grade schools in town, and so we followed through. We were always, at that point in time, they had levels. Mm-hmm. You could take advanced math, advanced English, advanced whatever. And so we were always, all of us together in the advanced classes. So we just were close the whole time. In the summers, after my freshman year in high school, turned out my friend Annie across the alley, her mother actually worked. So she was the only person I ever met who wasn't part of the community because she worked. And however, it turned out she did a lot of social work, and one of the things she knew was that the Girl Scouts were starting a new camp and they needed counselors. So they hired 4 of us who were friends to go and be very, very junior counselors. So starting in the summer after my freshman year in high school, until I was out of college, I was a camp counselor, taught swimming every summer. So it was, and that, again, was a great experience for being a manager. But, I just kept falling into these kinds of jobs
Was
working
that
with people.
was that in Wisconsin?
It
or
was in
nearby?
Wisconsin.
Yeah, it seems to be in southern Wisconsin, or
It was kind of in the middle of Wisconsin,
Uh-huh.
not definitely middle south, not middle
Mhm.
north.
Okay.
and when on our day off, this is back in the 40s. On our day off, we all, a couple of us would get together and we'd hitchhike all over Wisconsin to these different cities. You wouldn't think of doing that around here these days, but back in those days, it was safe and we all traveled all over. Nobody ever got in any trouble, and and we got to see a lot of Wisconsin. So, very different world.
Was reading a big part of your life as a young person?
Reading.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. As I told somebody just recently, I would read a lot of books. My dream was to be, when I was in 6th grade, to be a cowboy. And take all the sheep out in some mountain in Wyoming and live all summer without being responsible for anybody else. So you kind of know where that came from.
Yeah, it seems very straightforward.
But of course we read all the books, and there was a great public library. Read books for class and never had a problem with reading, and always enjoyed it. And the only thing I miss about my current life is I don't travel anymore. I used to read books. I used to travel all the time. So I read tons of books because I was almost on an airplane. And I haven't quite reorganized my life to take, 5 hours out of the week every week, or 5 or 10 hours out of every week, which is supposed to be reading time. And so I don't do as much now, but it's my plan to start again.
If you think about your high school years, were there any important, in addition to this mother of the friend who got you the summer camp counseling jobs, were there other important adult mentors or teachers that come to mind that were important to how your life played out, or?
Well, they, I don't think anybody paid very much attention to me. It was kind of quiet. I wish I could still remember where I had this, but back in this is going way back in my 1st grade when we were clearing out my mother's house, my daughter came across my 1st grade report card, and at this point, I'm a VP in a Fortune 500 company, and the report card says, "Anne will never be a leader, she's too quiet." So, don't predict what your kids are going to be, what your kids are going to do. But that wasn't a problem. I mean, I wasn't paying attention to my report cards at that age.
Good.
But it set my mother's expectations, which was somewhat of a problem. And when I graduated from high school, of course, I was looking about places to go to college. And I was not getting along well with my family for a wide variety of reasons, and even worse than most teenagers. So I wanted to go as far away as possible. So I thought Stanford would be a good idea. And I got accepted to Stanford. But again, my mother thought that big colleges wouldn't be good for me. So I went to Pomona instead. And because these big colleges, Harvard, Stanford, she had a brother who she thought didn't turn out well because he went to Harvard. And you know, so she wouldn't let me go to Stanford. My brother, who was far and away the smartest of the 5 kids, she wouldn't let him go to Harvard for, you know,
For social reasons?
just because she was afraid that these schools made you non-religious, and because they gave you facts, and so she was very hard. It was very hard. So she got one of the counselors at high school to tell me that I wasn't fit for Stanford and that I ought to go to a small school.
What were you thinking of with the desire to go to college? You know, what did you have a particular? You know, what were you hoping for your life at that age when you were graduating? What did you have ideas about what you wanted to do, or some people have strong ideas, others have hazier ideas? Where did you fall?
I came in the middle. I wanted to have a job which would make me self-sufficient, so I would not have to stay home and wash dishes like my mother. She really wasn't happy in that role, and so I wanted a job that I could do something with. And my interests were all math and science. So I'd had a woman for my chemistry teacher in high school, and she was very encouraging. And so when I went to college, I wanted to be a chemistry major.
And is that what you did once you got to Pomona?
Oh no, because I went to college, and unfortunately, my advisor, who had to approve. You know, the colleges are organized, I suppose they still are. So your advisor has to approve the classes you select.
Right.
My advisor was the chairman of the chemistry department, and he would not let me sign up for chemistry because he said, women in advanced chemistry labs are too distracting, and I will not have a chemistry major in my school.
So there were no women chemistry majors
Right.
during this person's
Tenure.
And what? And
Do you believe this?
Well, you know, some of that same attitude is still evident in the things that are in today's headlines about sexual harassment, things going on in the lab.
Things are better, but they are not fixed.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Wow.
So
anyway,
so what did I do? So I went through the catalog and figured out what I could major in that would let me take the most math and science without getting caught at it by any of the math and science. It turns out the way to do this was major in physical education. And so I got a woman for an advisor, and she didn't care what, she wasn't worried about distracting the men. And it turns out physical education, if you look at it in the right way, you worry about physics because you worry about how your muscles work and how strength, and so you have to worry about chemistry, you have to worry about biology. And so it turned out that I managed to take a lot of very interesting science classes in spite of this other guy's best efforts.
Wow.
Now the problem is I can't, they ask you on your resume and what did you major in?
Right.
And it's a little hard to explain, well, I majored in phys ed because nobody thinks you know anything when you major in phys ed. But I took it so that I could get a science background, and because I couldn't get a science background by actually majoring in science, they wouldn't allow that.
How were you financing your college education?
Fortunately, my parents paid for that.
Oh, great. So their fortunes
why they
had
didn't
turned.
object is beyond my comprehension. But, I mean, in my day, if somebody had told my daughters that you can't take chemistry, you're a woman, you can't take chemistry, I would demand my money back.
Absolutely.
But, it was a different time. And so they paid for my tuition Now, of course, when the college calls me and wants more money these days, they don't get it from me.
Yeah.
I said, I already paid my dues. My parents paid my dues, and I didn't get the education. So,
Had your mother gone to college?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, both my parents had graduated from college.
Right. So there was a tradition of that,
There
and there
was-
was an expectation that you would go.
There was an expectation we
Yeah.
would all go to college, which we
Okay.
all did.
Do you think, I was just thinking of, what year did you graduate from high school?
51.
1951. Was it, I was just wondering if any of that close cohort that you had from the neighborhood and all through school, were other young women, going to California to college, or were you unusual in going so far?
I was unusual. Nobody else came out.
Yeah. Were other of your friends, how unusual was it to go to college?
It was, everybody went to college.
Okay.
Everybody in the group went to college. And of course, Northwestern's there, so a lot of them went to Northwestern.
Right.
And others went back east to various colleges. So. The East Coast is not nearly as far away.
It's true. Well, outside of that discrimination about being able to take science courses, were there other big differences between the experiences of the male undergraduates and the female undergraduates at the college?
I don't know. I don't know that I paid much attention to that. Except being annoyed that, except having to figure out how to get around the attitude. Other than that, I don't think I paid much attention to any serious differences while I was at Pomona.
Well, in succeeding in taking this coursework, how did your personal interest develop in terms of science and math during those years?
Well, I loved it. I'd gone into college thinking I would love it, and I came out loving it. It was the biology teacher. I was looking around for what do you do with this random set of science classes, and he suggested I do physical therapy, and so I went back to Columbia to take physical therapy, which was supposedly the best physical therapy school at the time.
I was wondering about that because that's a big jump from Southern California to New York. So
I have moved around.
And I was wondering if it was the attraction of New York City.
In New York City. I wanted to live in New York City.
Okay.
So I did. Yeah. And so I went to Columbia and I went to physical therapy for a semester. But one of the classes that here we go again. One of the classes they give you in physical therapy is that you must follow the doctor's orders even if he's wrong. And I'm sure this probably isn't true anymore, but it was true then. And at this age, I sometimes see my physical therapist, and he feels free to overrule the doctor, and not exactly overrule him, but at least discuss something with him about why his ideas are better. And, but in those days, you weren't supposed to do that. And you just followed the doctor's orders, because all the doctors were men, and the vast majority of physical therapists were women, and so our job was to follow the doctor's orders. Well, we had enough overlapping classes and overlapping studies that it was perfectly clear to me they weren't any smarter than I was. And so I rebelled again and dropped out of physical therapy and stayed one more semester at Columbia. I went to Columbia Teachers College, which was great, gave me some chance to take a little more chemistry. And fortunately, my life has been, well, it was unlucky in some ways, had a lot of good luck. Fortunately, one of the guys from Evanston, one of the friends from Evanston in the neighborhood, friends, was an engineer. He was an engineer at IBM in Poughkeepsie. And we were both sort of loners on the East Coast. So once in a while we got together, and I told him how frustrated I was and I needed a job. And he said, become a programmer. And so I had never heard of IBM or programming, and the word computer was not in my college dictionary. So he had to take an afternoon or so to explain to me what a computer was, what a programmer was, what IBM was.
Well, and before we get into that sequence with your friend from Evanston that got you into IBM, I just had a couple quick questions.
Oh, sure.
Just about. Well, one, I was interested where you were living in New York City while you were at Columbia, and just, what you made of that environment.
I loved it. Upper West Side near Columbia.
Okay.
And I moved around a couple times, but for various reasons. But Upper West Side, and had a fabulous time. And when I finally got a job, I continued to live there for a while, and another year. And I had a friend who'd come with me from Pomona to do physical therapy. She stuck it out. And but we were at the show every night. There was, the theater, the ballet, the opera. It was just never ending. All the museums. I took full advantage of living in New York City, and I loved it.
Well, less pleasantly, this is a very kind of scary time on the world scene with the kind of the heights or depths of the Cold War, depending on the way you look at it, I guess.
Right.
What was that? Can you talk about, what that Cold War kind of central period was like for you?
I don't think the Cold War impacted what I was doing very much. The Korean War, I had to take, there were no flights, so I had to take the train from Chicago to LA. And of course the trains during that period were primarily filled with soldiers.
Wow.
So I definitely knew a lot of the guys who went off to Korea. And one of the interesting things about the guys who came back that came up in a conversation just yesterday was that so many of them had, I guess I learned this because I'd lived in New York, but they'd grown up in Brooklyn or Bronx, and which were not wealthy areas. They were marginal. And they came back, and their whole perception of the world had changed because they discovered that I'm just as smart as the wealthy white guys who live in Manhattan.
From serving
From
together.
the service, because they were all in it together. And you had to, the service in that war was brutal. And you had to protect everybody who was with you, and you had to make decisions in a hurry. They all learned they were just as good at all of these planning and everything as the rich white guys, and yet they were supposed to live as second-class citizens. And that's what had been happening before the war. And they all lived in, not slums, but definitely not Evanston.
Yeah.
And so it was a big change for them. Fortunately, the country was based on some of your questions, the country at that time we were the only advanced economy that wasn't completely mangled and destroyed.
Right.
So the economy here was expanding at a great rate. There were more than enough jobs for everybody. So these guys came back from the war, knew they were just as smart, and went after the good jobs, just like the wealthy white guys. And, we don't do, that's not true anymore. The veterans who return today, there are not enough jobs for the ones that came from poverty.
Right.
And yet they have been there and learned they're just as smart as the guys who are getting the jobs. So I think that you were asking about turmoil and
Yeah,
social turmoil.
sure.
I think that's having listened to it after World War II and listening to it now, I think that's a huge difference in what's happening to people. And why there's one of the many reasons, but one of the reasons why there's so much anger.
The frustration to have that realization and then not be able to act on it.
And then not be able to follow through and have the opportunities.
Very interesting. Your friend, the engineer with IBM, who suggested that that you become a programmer, had you had, I mean, surely you knew of the existence of computers before that, or had you?
I had a math teacher in college who devoted about 10 minutes one day in math class, to explaining to us that there was such a thing as a computer. And that was my experience with computers.
Okay.
So fortunately, I listened to my friend in spite of the fact I didn't know anything. And so I walked down to world headquarters, which, if you knew anything, you wouldn't do. But since I didn't know anything, I just walked into world headquarters and said, I want to apply for a job as a programmer.
And where was the world headquarters?
Madison and 57th.
Okay. And this is the, that is then the very building that you had your training, et cetera, in after you, well, describe that. You walk into the lobby. I imagine it's a, big New York office building lobby.
Right. Yeah. And IBM has it set up so that it's on a corner, one of the busiest corners in Manhattan for business people.
Right.
That whole area is big business. And so two sides of the wall of the building, on the first floor, not all the way up, were totally glass. And in that space was a 705. And so that's why it was set up like this. So people could walk by and see what a computer was. I wasn't the only one who didn't know anything about computers.
Yeah.
So I walked in and said I wanted to apply for a job, and they said, well, personnel is on the 10th floor or whatever it was, and take the elevator over there. So I went up. So I sat down and chatted with the person from the personnel person, and we were doing really well until she asked me what I'd major in college. That didn't go over too well, but then I talked to her about, but look at all the math and chemistry and physics classes I've taken. I really can do this, because she said, you're supposed to be a mathematician to do this job. And so I said, yeah, but I've taken those classes. I just didn't take them under the right labels. But they're all here. And so she said, okay, well, grudgingly, she allowed me to take their aptitude test.
Did you take it right then and there?
I can't remember if I took it right then and there or came back for it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't take it right then and there. And, it's typical aptitude test. And it was, in my opinion, a very good aptitude test for programming once I learned what programming was. So I passed the aptitude test. And so they said classes start on June 5th or whatever it was, come back. And
were you, at that point, an employee?
Once I started class.
Okay.
And it was a 6-week class, 4 weeks of training in general about, first of all, we had to learn all the EAM equipment, the sorters and the key punches, all that stuff. And you had to, of course, you had to know how to punch a Hollerith card. If the best key punch you had was Model 10, which means it doesn't have letters on it, it just has numbers. And if you want to put in like an instruction with alphabetic characters, you have to know which numbers to punch.
To represent that character.
To represent that character. So this is the kind of thing we had to learn in our first 4 weeks. And we tried, and we had to learn, so we learned all that EM equipment and wired all the boards. And they kept giving us, of course, challenging, make it do this, make it do that, and you had to wire the boards.
This was sort of a plug board operation, is it not, to have that sorter or tabulator perform some sorting operation or mathematical function? So did they consider that to be programming those machines, or how did they speak about that?
Okay, it turned out that this is world headquarters, and they're trying to train you to be either, their goal was to train you to either be, as I found out later, a salesman or a system service girl, which meant you had to go out and help the customer
run their machine,
wire their boards.
Ah.
So you had to know, so one of the things they wanted you to learn was how to program in case the customer needed that. But most of their customers still had EAM equipment. So
that was more the centerpiece. And
that was definitely a centerpiece. It was definitely important to learn how to, and I got very good at wiring boards in a hurry. But then we also programmed. We programmed the 650, and we programmed the 705, which was down in the. Now the good news about being a woman, once there was good news, is that they wanted to make it look easy to use a computer. And so the women got to do all their debugging and testing on the 705 downstairs. And since there were almost no women in the class, we really had great access.
By being on display in the window.
For being on display in the window.
And so for that reason, you all had way more computer time
we had
than
way
your
more
male.
computer time.
Oh my gosh. What was roughly the fraction of men and women in your?
There were about 20 people in the class, of which 3 were women.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the women in the course form any sort of esprit de corps?
There were 2 of us that are still friends.
So.
The other woman was, she was great, but she had, for some reason or other, had a lot of family or something in the Caribbean, and so she left and went back. So I don't know her anymore, but the other women were still friends. And so yeah, it was a good deal for the women. We stuck together. The interesting part about this class, well, there was this first part. And then there was 2 weeks at the end where we actually had to do real customer support on the programming the 705. And so we really did have to write payroll programs, and that was the big thing at the time, was getting payroll automated. It helps a lot to have accurate payroll. And as soon as we got accurate payroll, then we started automating banks, because it also helps to have accurate bank statements. So we did that. And then it turned out at the end, they gave us all a test. How much did you learn? Going into the test, they told us, if you're in the top 10% or something, you get to go into sales. And everybody else can, be a support or system service girl or go into programming or something. But we took the test, and and unfortunately, some of the women came out in the top 10%. This I had not counted on.
Encountering that situation,
Yes.
they hadn't thought it
Never
through.
crossed their mind. So they had to read us a letter from Watson, who was the president of the company, who wrote a letter to be read to the women in the class explaining that women could not be in sales. Doesn't matter how good you are, you cannot, I cannot, he said things like, I cannot send a woman alone into the office of a corporate officer. Yeah, so that was so much for that. So system service girl didn't sound like it was a long-term career, so I decided to be a programmer. And turned out that was great because once I really got to program, I loved it. You know, some people like to do Sudoku or
Yes.
puzzles or other things. Like, I loved programming. So and if I had to do it 24 hours, I was doing programming and I would have, during the day, but it was easier to get computer time at night, so I'd work at night too. I just thought this was such fun that it didn't bother me if I had to work 10 hours, 12 hours a day. I just liked it.
Well, I want to talk to you about, to the extent that you're able to articulate, what about it was a pleasure. It just seems like since they hadn't anticipated that women could do so well on the test, that they ran literally the question all the way up to the head of the organization to see whether or not you should be made a salesperson.
Yes, right.
That's fascinating.
It's fascinating that they had never anticipated that women would, I'm not sure, would do so well. I'm not sure that they'd ever actually had a class for women that had women in it before.
Well, that's what I was wondering, if you had a sense of how many iterations of the class they had even had.
I have the feeling that we were very early.
It must be.
And that they just, they'd never had this
situation.
This happened before, so here we were. And so, and this is the 50s. This is 1956. Long before there were anybody had even thought about non-discrimination laws or anything, so.
Well, could you talk about just your impressions of the firm in that first year that you were involved with it? Just what it was like to be a part of the organization. Did it give you a feeling of pride? Was it something you were eager to tell your friends about? Just wondering what it meant for you to be a new employee of IBM in 1956.
Well, everybody was curious. I have to say that. I mean, do you remember the 705 at all? It was just a character, had character addresses, and I forget exactly how many characters it had, but it meant you could have really, really long numbers. And of course, I would try to explain this to my mother, who was a mathematician, who knew that you didn't have accuracy to anywhere near, to anywhere near that length of number. And but it was fun trying to explain computers to people who had no clue, who just. Most people were like me. They'd never heard of IBM. It was, and computer wasn't in their dictionary either. So it's not that I got anything special. And so it was fun to explain to people. And as I say, I loved programming, and I got transferred into, right off the bat, I got transferred into research, working for a man, Dr. Paul Roth, who was doing some algorithms in mathematical algorithms to look at circuits, analyze circuits, and reduce the number of components, because back in those days, discrete components, you could take a few components out, you saved a lot of money. So, so I got to program all these. And since it turned out I liked programming, I had a great time. And that's why I was working night and day. It doesn't bother me. And so it was great. I was sort of in awe of being in research, because there weren't, when I started at least, there There were no other women in research except for secretaries. And so nobody quite knew what to make of me, but I had a good time.
Now, I believe there's this Watson lab at Columbia.
Yes.
Was that where you had gone, or is that a different?
No, that was different. My other friend, my friend that I'm still friends with, who was in my class.
From the class.
She was from there.
Oh.
But you know, I just came out of the blue, walked in the door, and then I got sent to Poughkeepsie to IBM Research, which was in Poughkeepsie at that time, and then moved down to Lamb Estate in Croton. And then eventually they built the real research center. But by that time I was transferred out.
Okay, so it's in Poughkeepsie where you were working with
Poughkeepsie and Croton.
Okay.
And Lamb Estate in Croton on Hudson, yeah.
Okay.
So people ask me, where did you live? And I say, up and down the Hudson River. When I worked for IBM, I lived in several places, from starting in Manhattan and ending in Poughkeepsie, all up and down the Hudson River.
You just got an apartment nearby to each place?
Just getting apartments nearby, that's
okay.
right.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that you went from doing these like payroll programs, you know, the first programs, which, well, the question I'd written down would, how did IBM frame the world of computing to you, office automation or scientific computing? And it seems like the first two things you did were office automation and scientific computing.
Right.
So
they didn't know what they were doing any more than I did. It was just so early, you know?
Right.
It was so early that nobody knew exactly how to explain anything. And I just happened to fall into a job I really enjoyed.
With this, was it, so the SAGE effort must have been going on at this time.
SAGE was
Did
going.
you?
I wasn't involved with SAGE.
Okay. But
I knew about it, but I wasn't involved.
So this would have been was that also kind of the SAGE programming was done out at RAND, so that wasn't
it wasn't
with IBM.
It certainly wasn't in any parts of IBM where I was, and it was not in research, where I was.
Okay.
And then after research, I transferred into the Stretch project, Stretch Harvest project. So
right.
It I wasn't involved with it.
Well, in thinking, if we could talk about the IBM research experience a little bit more, could you just, so I imagine research had their own computer or computers.
No.
No? How did it work to do the circuit job?
Well, they had, computers were scarce. There was one computer in Poughkeepsie that research got to use, and a whole bunch of and everybody in Poughkeepsie got to use. Everybody who needed a 704 got to use this computer. And so that's one of the reasons I worked at night, because all the rest of these guys got priority on the 704, and they got it during the day, and so I went in at night.
Were they using, what were the other people using the computer for?
A lot of it was circuit design, engineering design. That's where the engineering was happening for all the computers at those days.
So using the computer to build the next computer.
Build the next computer.
Interesting. So this the research project, the circuit emulation or circuit design program that you were working with is kind of was of a piece with
Of a piece of the whole thing, exactly.
Interesting.
And notice that I went from the 705 to the 704.
You went back a step. Well,
The 704 looks a lot more like recent computers than the 705.
could you talk about that? I don't.
The computer design. Well, the 705, as I said, was character addressing, and and there's nothing like that anymore. Do you have a question?
What's character driven?
Well, normally, after that, it was, the 704 was word addressing. And then you had, sometimes you got to bytes, but, so character addressing was, they didn't have bytes, but that's basically what it was, except in the early days, they were 6 bits. So you didn't have, all you had was capital letters and very limited special characters. We've improved.
Did the 704 come earlier sequentially than the 705?
No, they were basically together.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And the 704.
705 was specifically designed for business applications. Oh. It was a decimal machine. It was specifically designed for business applications.
Okay.
And the 704 was specifically designed for scientific applications.
I see.
That's the difference. Sorry. And as it turned out, it's just as easy to do business applications on a 704 as it is on a 705. But they didn't know. One of the things I wish somebody would do is write up some of this history of, as you go through these different computers I had, their designs, their memory design, and their architecture. They kept trying all these different things. The 650 is different from the 705, which is different from the 704. And of course the Stretch was different, and the 7090 was different, and and the 360 was different. I've had a good time trying to remember all of this stuff.
Yes, I can imagine.
Because it's fascinating how we had to try so many different designs to come up with the 360, the 370, the computers we have today, and eventually they all sort of became similar. But it took a long time and a lot of designs to get there, and nobody knew which was going to work out.
Path searching in a way.
Yeah. And so that's how come. I wish somebody would. I think it would be great if somebody went back, some good historian went back and did this, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, to explore all those options.
All those reasons why we thought the 650 was the right design, why we thought the 705 would be the right design for business applications, why we thought you needed the 704 for scientific applications, and how the word lengths moved around and why, and it's a very interesting history.
It is.
And
well, when you were doing this work with Paul Roth, programming the 704, to the extent that you can recall working on that project, what was, I'm just interested in, what that meant. What did you do? Where were you sitting? What were you using? What language, or was it octal encoding, or just what how'd it go?
They did make us in class write our first program in octal, so that nothing was relative addressing. And which means that if you had left out an instruction, you had to go down and change everything after that by hand. So I think they made us do this so we would appreciate assembler. Which we did. So anyway, by the time I got to Paul's project, it was assembler. And he had another guy working with him named Eric Wagner, and I shared an office with Eric, and so I often discussed with Eric how these algorithms would work in a program, just sort of what priorities should take place, and what do you optimize because I don't know anything about
the circuits.
about
yeah.
the circuit design, and so it was another one of these absolutely fascinating jobs. It just went from one interesting thing to another. And most of the time we were in Lamb Estate, which is where I was sharing an office with Eric.
And were you writing things out on legal pads or scribbling on a chalkboard? And
No,
then
they had special coding pads.
a special printed pad of
Printed
paper.
pads for coding, right. So you had, so you had a column for your, if in case you wanted to put an address in there, and then the column for the instruction, and a column for the next address, and another column for the comments. So you could have, that was a coding pad. Do you have some of those around?
I don't know. I would hope so. I imagine that we do, but
Do you know?
I'm not sure. It's something that we can look up right afterward.
Yeah, because those, we used those for years. They were the same and everywhere, and everybody who programmed in those early days used it exactly like that. They were all the same.
And you're using a pencil to fill it out?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so you could erase it.
And then once you have
Once you do that,
Mm.
then either you can go to the key punch, or you can get, if you're lucky, you get a secretary to do the key punching. One of the interesting things, skipping ahead a little bit, on the Stretch project, we had a secretary who had just a high school education, but she was doing all the key punch for the whole group. And after a few months, she started correcting our errors.
Wow, from reading
Just
it?
having read so many programs. She was awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did she tell you, or did she?
Yeah, she would say, she would come over, did you really mean this? Oh, you go, oh no.
What a great safety net to have.
Yeah, it's really nice to have your software debugged before you even get to the machine.
Before you got to the coding pad, did you?
Oh, we had flow
outline-
charts?
Okay.
Yeah, we had flow charts and lots of,
These were things that you would draw,
You would
pencil
draw,
and paper,
yes.
and
well, I'm sure you've seen the flow charts. Yep, that's exactly what they look like.
okay.
You'd put in every different function and what you do if it worked or didn't work or whatever. Yeah.
To establish the kind of the overall logic of it.
To establish the overall logic and caught a lot of bugs in your thinking because you had to write down everything. And if you came to a dead end, it was easier to figure that out then than after you're on the computer. So, so flowcharts were very helpful.
Did you have a process for kind of saying like, okay, we like this flow chart, this looks good, we're going to move on to getting the coding pads out of the drawer and going?
I wasn't very organized about that.
It was up to you, in other words?
It was entirely up to me.
Yeah.
And, once we'd agreed on how to, sort of the design of the big design of the algorithms, then everything after that was up to me. Code it, flow chart it, so you know what you're doing, code it, get a key punch, run it, see how good you, see whether or not you got that right.
So if it was you or the secretary who had done the key punching, you have then the stack of cards or the deck.
One of those big card boxes. Do you have some of those around?
We do. Who then takes that, or how does that then get to the computer?
I carry it.
You carry it, yeah.
And that's why it was really lucky they had long words, because you could take the end of the, you use 72 columns, but you had 80 column cards, and those last 8 columns were sequence numbers. So when you drop the deck of cards, you can put them back in the sorter.
Oh.
And this happened a lot.
It did. It
Yeah.
was, because you had to carry these.
Everybody was carrying these things around, and every once in a while somebody would trip or you bump
Sure.
into something, and and the cards are on the floor, and you just, so that's why I learned how to wire sorters, really.
And then, what was the turnaround like? What would come back to you?
I was there.
Oh, you stood there while it ran.
I was the only one in the room.
Oh, you were running the machine.
Yes.
Okay, you had control of the machine.
Total control. Nobody else was there. So put your cards in, read the cards. You watch the lights on the console, see if it was doing the right thing, and And then
Were there like
there were printers, so you could get printouts. You could, basically, pretty much the printouts came out on the printer. And
Would you always do a printout?
well, unless it crashed.
Right. I was wondering if while it was running, there's certain things going on. There's of course the display lights, but I was wondering if there were any other sort of like physical clues about if things were going right or wrong. Like if you could tell if something was going wrong by a sound or...
You could tell from the lights.
From the lights. And were there... could you talk about how that worked? What did you see?
Well, when you get into a loop, it's really obvious.
Just a repeating pattern.
A repeating pattern, right?
Huh.
And the other thing that people spend a lot of time doing was writing to mag tape, reading and writing from mag tape, because there were a lot of data out there on mag tape. And that was the other thing that was so fascinating about watching other people's programs, is that I could watch I'd get there early in the machine room, they'd have the machine, and so they would, every once in a while you get this little blip that they actually did some computing, and all the rest of the time was reading or writing from mag tape. And you could see this on the console lights. So you could see exactly how much was going on in anybody's program.
Huh.
And so the console lights were pretty good, pretty good tool.
I heard the talk from a historian who was talking about earlier computer systems, and people were wiring into the machine kind of a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
Was that?
I heard that talk.
Oh, yeah.
And
did that?
Never came.
Never
I never
encountered
saw that.
Okay.
And he thought it was very useful. I did fine with the lights. What can I say? I didn't know about loudspeakers, and the lights worked really well.
Okay. Let's see. So, was the circuit optimization programming your major task while you were with research?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess there's this question about when Fortran starts to come into the picture. Was it with research or?
Well, I'd always, I'd started programming in octal, so I was perfectly happy with assembler. But I did do while I was in research, I had, they did want me to try using Fortran. So I did do some Fortran. It was beta, they considered it a beta site. And it was fine, but I was so used to assembler by that time that later on when I had to start from scratch, then I was happy to use Fortran. But right then it was all in assembler, and the assembler and I was so familiar with it. It wasn't a big deal for me.
Yeah.
But as Fortran, they did the I/O for you, which I did appreciate, because when you're doing, back in those days, all you got was the computer. You didn't get any I/O routines. You didn't get anything. You just got the computer.
Oh. So would you have to, let's say, with your circuit emulation program, you would have to
You'd have to know
tell
how
the
to.
computer how to read from the tape or
Right.
use the printer? You would
Yep.
have to,
You had to know that.
and you would include that in
Yep.
your deck of cards.
Yep.
Hmm.
It was way back.
Did you save those?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
of course.
So you had your, so in a sense, you had your own
You
library.
had your own library, right?
Hmm. And how many other, were you exchanging, were the programmers in research sharing card decks and exchanging libraries? Did you get cards from other people or
Well,
copies?
eventually, there were 3 of us working for Paul, doing stuff.
Mhm.
2 other people came later. And of course, I shared all my all my subroutines with
Right.
them. And so we all used basic drivers the same. But and as much as they were interested in any of the other stuff I'd written. But outside of that, I didn't do much with any of the other groups in research.
Mhm.
And at the time, of course, I heard about all the wonderful things they were doing, but I didn't, as I say, when I arrived in research, I was probably about the only woman
Right.
in the organization that wasn't a secretary. So
Was that?
I don't think they knew how to talk to, they just didn't know what to say.
So perhaps they were maybe the male programmers, the other male programmers in Poughkeepsie may have been more.
They might have
Chummy
been
and
more
sharing
community.
things.
I just
Right.
really don't know.
Right.
It's
Hard to
just-
tell from where you were.
Hard to tell from where I was, right?
Yeah. Well, Stretch comes along pretty quickly.
Yes.
Could you talk about how you came into the Stretch effort and, give us a sense of, how important Stretch was, your impression of how important Stretch was for the company at the time, and just kind of, introduce us to you coming into it.
Well, I'm not sure how I managed to get lucky enough to get transferred, except that I had really done what my part of what Paul needed. That they were using it in engineering.
Okay.
And so they didn't need me anymore.
They had the tool. in
They
other
had the
words.
tool.
Okay.
And so it was a good time to move to another project. So I moved to Stretch, which was in Poughkeepsie. And that was nice. And that was a much more, there were actually, Fran Allen was on that project with me. And so it was nice to have another woman who was, and we moved, the first thing we did was write a Fortran compiler. Now Stretch wasn't built at that point. There wasn't a Stretch. We used the simulator. And, I looked up this guy's name, but
I think I looked it up too. John Koch and Harwood Kolsky. Does that sound right?
those are 2 great guys, but
Oh.
they aren't the guys who wrote the simulator.
Okay.
And if you want me to send it to you, I'd be happy to.
Sure. Yeah.
If I don't think of it before I leave. But anyway, the guy who wrote the simulator, for the Stretch simulator, was really good. And really good. And so that's what we used to debug all the software. As long as I was on Stretch, that's what we used. They never did get a real machine up and running while I was still there.
Okay. Can I ask about how that worked? Because I'm not. So were you using again like a 704?
704
And you would.
with a Stretch simulator. And then it was just sort of like today. The Stretch simulator worked just like an operating system works today. And then we would feed it our applications, whatever, our Fortran compilers or whatever.
And so it would be operating much slower than.
Then the Stretch.
Correct. So, but you could tell if your software would work properly.
Yes, but the simulator was so good, you really could debug your software.
Wow.
So when they they finally got a Stretch and put the Fortran on it, it worked. So yeah, it was really good. He really, I wish I could remember his name because he really did a good job. So yeah, that's what it was like as long as I was there. It was a simulator.
And I was wondering if, I know Stretch seemed like it was a major, a very large hardware effort.
Yes.
I wonder, was it an equally large software effort?
Well, this group was Stretch Harvest.
Okay.
And the Harvest was a major software effort.
And now Harvest is the special, it was the special machine for the NSA to do whatever.
Decryption.
Okay, decryption, so pattern matching and statistics and stuff like that. So
And for its day, it was very good. I hate to think what NSA could do now. It was so good for its day, and I'm sure they have kept up. I'm sure they're just as far ahead of the world now as they were then.
I think they are like the largest employer of mathematicians or something like that.
Did you know that Tom Lehrer used to work at NSA? You know Tom Lehrer, the music?
The humorous music guy? No, I had no idea.
He worked at the NSA?
He also worked at a company, Baird and Associates, which is a Cambridge, Massachusetts place.
He was from he was from that area.
Yeah.
And then he is a professor at Santa Cruz, or at least he was when my kids were there. He's probably retired by now.
Oh, that's fun. I had no idea.
It was great because my kids had grown up with Tom Lehrer music because we were all there together. And I mean, he had left by the time I got there, but he had instilled Tom Lehrer attitudes. And so my kids grew up with Tom Lehrer music, and so they went to Santa Cruz and took math classes from Tom Lehrer.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea. Well, did you know him then on this Harvest project?
I did not. I did
Okay.
not know him on the Harvest project. He had already left NSA by the time I got to NSA. So, but of course, everybody around knew him. He was mythical.
Well, were you NSA was later or?
No, the first thing we did was the Fortran compiler so we could do anything.
Okay.
Okay. And then we wrote editors and, just sort of system tools for that would run on Stretch. I wrote the stuff that would run on Stretch. Fran Allen had a lot to do with what actually ran on Harvest.
Okay.
But the fundamental part of that was, I still think, was still done at NSA because it was all classified.
Right. So they would use the tools to do whatever.
We produced the tools and they did
would use them.
They did the magic.
Okay. And Harvest was a gigantic adjunct piece of hardware to the Stretch.
Much bigger than Stretch. And you know about tractor tapes?
I think this was a machine that was feeding the stuff into Harvest. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I think there might be a picture of tractor tapes somewhere here, but they had all these tape drives in a U shape, and they could manage which one from the machine, from the Stretch. You could manage which one would be active at the moment, and it would load or unload tapes. It could move them around, and was absolutely fascinating to watch.
It was a kind of an automated tape system.
It was an automated tape system, and I forget how many tape drives there were, but there were quite a few.
And Harvest, was it kind of like a gigantic main memory in a way, or what? I mean,
it was a big processor.
It was a processor. Interesting. Oh, I guess it had to hold all this.
Had to analyze all the stuff that was streaming through
those tapes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It just
Well, did you have to get a security clearance
Yes.
then when you went on to that?
Yes.
What was that? Was that a big deal? Was that trivial for you? Was that just
That
paperwork
one,
to fill out?
that one was, they did, what do they call them, interviews?
Yes.
For those. And so I had to go down and get interviewed, whatever they do for you. And, but that wasn't very hard. They ask you a lot of questions. And you tell them the answer. They either say yes or no. And so
Right.
So I got a clearance, so I could go back and forth to NSA. And it was.
Was that
Pretty
more kind of like client meetings that you were doing when
Mhm.
you went to visit with them? They were
Yeah.
telling you what they needed in terms of the tools?
What they needed in terms of the tools and how they were going to use it and where it was going to be and what they needed, basically what kind of tools they needed.
Right. I would imagine it's my impression that they were at this time, certainly at this time, such a major user of digital electronic computers that I just wonder if there was kind of a cadre of people at IBM devoted to kind of serving them as a customer.
I'm sure there must have been. We sort of had our own group and our own access and our own area that we worked with at NSA. Of course, NSA is extremely partitioned. So we worked with the group that was going to use Harvest.
Okay.
And one of the person I shared an office with while I was doing some of this work had worked at NSA. And then she was up here in Poughkeepsie and came to IBM and made sure we did everything right. And but that was very narrow.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what it's like now, but back in those days, you walked into NSA, there were people who checked everything. They looked at every piece of paper you took in, every piece of paper you took out. Everything in your briefcase, your purse, whatever, everything was checked, coming and going.
You would go to Fort Meade to have these meetings. Interesting. And were there in terms of you described another woman who came, who was in, I guess, programming and mathematics and stuff, who came to join IBM. Were there in the kind of NSA Harvest people you were talking to, was it a mix of men and women, or was it similar to what was on the IBM side?
It was, it certainly wasn't exclusively men.
Okay. I guess that's really the test at the time, right?
Are there any
Some
women
or
in the-
none? Yeah.
Right. You could walk around NSA and there were women there. And,
Let's see. I'm just reviewing the
that's
question
okay.
list here.
David, one
Yes.
a very small question. Did you know Charlie Moore?
Charlie Bourne. Marc's asking if you knew Charlie Bourne.
no,
Was he a...
not that I remember. That doesn't mean I didn't know.
Information retrieval systems for the CIA and the NSA. I've interviewed him.
For the CIA, they were, yes, they don't talk to each other.
But he also did some work for the NSA.
Okay.
as we've come to learn. Here. For how long were you working on that project?
I only stayed there a couple of years. It was another one of those unfortunate situations because when I joined the project, Fran Allen didn't have had some problems with this also, but I'm sure that's in her interview. But when I joined the project, I was one of the more experienced programmers, and I definitely knew how how to manipulate a 704 to do what I wanted. And so after about a year, there's a group of us, maybe half a dozen, 8 or 10 people, working on some of the Stretch systems. As I say, Fran was more oriented toward working on some of the tools that would be supportive of harvest, but you still needed tools to work the Stretch, so you could, assemble code and run your Fortran compilers and stuff. So, so my group was focused on that. After about a year, IBM sent Fran and me together to management training school. We were the first 2 women ever to go through management training in IBM engineering.
Wow.
So, it turns out they tell you a few things in there they should never have told us. One was that managers, we expect, just in IBM's hierarchy, managers make a few percentage more than the highest paid person working for them, which is what you would sort of expect, right? A little bit more. And there were exceptions to this in research, but nowhere else, basically nowhere else in the company. Because sometimes there were research scientists that were really good.
Right.
But we're not really, they didn't want to make it into managers. So there were exceptions in research, but in basic, all the rest of IBM, the managers were expected to make a little more than any of the people working for them. And another thing they told us was that you guys, because you come into management training, this is special, you're the people that we hope will become senior executives, and the background we look for is MBAs, and in particular, Harvard MBAs. And we will pay for your education if you'll go to Harvard and get an MBA. Great. So I come back. It turns out that, and of course I get the salaries of all the guys who are working for me. They're all men. I get their salaries. Turns out I am making, if I had gotten a 50% raise, I would be making as much as the lowest paid man working for me.
So you were off the bottom of the chart.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm supposed to be making, according to the management training, I'm supposed to be making more. And instead of that, I'm making a fraction of what the lowest paid man working for me is making.
They didn't realize this when they disclosed those salaries to you?
Apparently not. So I asked my manager, who was Sully Campbell, who was a great guy. He was really good. If he could adjust this. So he managed to get me a 35% raise, which was beyond belief in IBM. But I'm still making 15% less than the lowest paid man working for me. So this doesn't look to me like there's, just staying here and going up, I'm never going to make it. So then the next thing I decided to do, which is why I wasn't ever lying, I decided, well, I'll go back to school. I get this MBA. Turns out Harvard wouldn't take women.
For the love of God.
So here's what they tell us.
They just wouldn't admit, what year was this?
59.
1959.
Yeah. And so here they are. They tell us, here's what you need to do. Here's what you should be making. Here's what you need to do to get ahead. And then you go try it, and none of it works. Because you're a woman.
Clearly we're in a situation like your training course.
Uh-huh.
They'd never, you're the first ones there.
That's right.
They probably, they obviously must have thought you could go to Harvard.
Obviously must have. It just,
Unbelievable.
if you're a man, you never think about it. Why would you
Right.
think about it? If all the
Sure.
people before you have been men, why would you think about it that Harvard doesn't let women in? So,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. So anyway, it seemed like, what do you do when everything they recommend is impossible because you're a woman? So I just said, I'm leaving. I'm gonna go to school. I'm gonna go to Berkeley. I'm gonna do something else and try to get my head together and figure out what on earth do you do in this kind of situation.
What was Fran's reaction? Fran Allen's reaction?
She stuck it out.
Huh.
She wasn't, I can't say that she was any happier, but she stuck it out. And you know, Fran was the first woman to become an IBM fellow, but years after she should have been. And she was very unhappy about that. It was just the same thing. They never occurred to them that a woman would do the kind of work that was that they needed for fellows.
Right.
They expected, and she does this, and she does more and more, and they don't know what to do about it because they thought fellow meant men.
Wow. It's hard even to hear you talk about it, and it's making me feel frustrated just listening to you describe it. I can't imagine what it was like for you. Well, that answers my question about your decision to leave IBM and go to UC Berkeley. One, on the technical side of things, I was just curious if there was things that you learned while you were programming for Stretch, programming for Harvest. I was wondering about if there were things you learned, lessons you learned, techniques that were important later on.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Could you?
Yes, and I would say also about the management training class. The fact that it ended up being upsetting, it was extremely useful to have had a management training class and to know what they ought to be like. Because Tymshare Tymshare was a startup. They didn't do management training classes until much later. And so it was very helpful to have been through a management training class. Same at Livermore. I managed a small group at Livermore, and it's helpful to have management training. You have some idea what people expect of a manager, and so that was great. And of course, I did the Fortran compiler there, and it was, well, when I went over to Livermore, they didn't have a Fortran compiler. They were writing a new one. It was very helpful to have already written one. So, now it's not that I wrote the one on Stretch by myself. There was a group of, but you know what everybody's doing.
Right.
It's a team project, and the same when we got to Livermore. I mean, this is what you want me to add, and next thing, okay. I don't have to wonder what that means.
Right.
So it was very, very helpful. Right.
Interesting.
And I also designed and I also did an editor for the 6600 at Livermore, and again, we'd worked on that same kind of how do you build editors, how do you build tools like that for the Stretch, and so it was very helpful.
So you'd thought through many of these similar
similar questions and problems, and how do you even think about that kind of a problem?
At this time and in these contexts, I'm not sure that I properly understand what an editor is.
Well, that's a good question, because it's nothing like today's editor.
Right. I can. That was my suspicion.
What you're really doing in a lot of these contexts is keeping the printout of the code, and what you're doing is helping identify, as we talked about earlier, there's the code sheets.
Right.
You get punch cards, you print them, and then you have a listing. And the editor helps you look at this listing and mark it up and things like that.
On a teleprompter, or
it's not actually. you're really doing all of this by hand, but it does give you some other look at this code. And so it's because there weren't any, we didn't have teletypes.
Right.
Until I got to Livermore.
So it was in a way to modify this code listing. You know, you would kind of put the card deck with the program into the machine,
Right.
and then you could load this editor and whatever content of the editor, and it would change that listing.
Change that, right.
And then could it produce a new
cards.
card deck for you?
New cards.
Interesting. So much more efficient than
Right.
repunching
Repunching all
few
the
number
cards.
of cards. I get it. Or you could do some global change, I guess, across the.
Yeah,
Or maybe you
and well, one of the handy things it did is, of course, when you repunched, it reordered.
Oh.
Those last 8 columns are very helpful.
Interesting. Well, so you decided, I think it was in 1961, to leave IBM, go back to school. You chose UC Berkeley. You know, why did you choose Berkeley, and what did you choose at Berkeley?
Well, I had a random assortment of classes, and because I didn't know what I was doing. But I chose Berkeley because at least it was Northern California. And I went. I hadn't been permitted to go to Stanford, so I just gave me.
You permitted yourself.
Right. So now that I was paying, I could go to Berkeley. So I just took a random assortment of classes, took some math, took some French, took some psychology, you know, as I say, a random assortment of classes.
Were you enrolled as a graduate student, or?
Probably.
Yeah.
One of those random graduate students. Right?
Yeah, okay. It seems like it must have been a fascinating time to be in Berkeley, going to school in Berkeley.
Was.
61, 62, could you?
Well, it was, let's
Or-
see, 60.
60?
59, 60, 60.
Okay.
60, 61. I guess you might be right. It might be 61. 60, let's see. 61. You're right.
Yeah, that's on the cusp of it, right?
Yeah, everything was. It was another, you know, I managed to land in Manhattan at the right time, managed to land at Berkeley at the right time. Right. It was a great time to be there, and had a great time with the friends I made at Berkeley, and but it was, for me personally, it was more of a sorting out, what do I do? And then it turned out that, as you probably know, they delivered the Stretch that year to Livermore. So since I hadn't figured out I was going to, you know, actually pursue a career in anything else, I went to Livermore. I was practically the only person in California who knew how to program the Stretch, so it wasn't too hard to get the job.
Did they call you, or did you?
No, I went out there.
Okay.
And I knew about this, and I went out there, and wasn't too hard to get the job. And the first thing they needed was as I said earlier, they needed a Fortran compiler. Oh, I'm the person. I wrote the other one. Now I can write this one. And the one at Livermore was much more efficient.
The compiler.
The compiler. For a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons.
Reasons for the machine.
A lot of reasons
The
why it was
machine
more
different?
efficient.
Okay.
They didn't have to solve all of the world's problems, and didn't have to be readable by a lot of people who didn't know how to read code, and a lot of these other problems that you had to deal with.
Right, because Right.
Didn't
because,
have to deal with every possible reconfiguration of Stretch. They had a Stretch. It was like
for this machine, and I would imagine they would never want anything to leave Livermore, so you don't have to
Right,
worry
nothing
about
ever leaves.
sharing it.
Right.
So you
Actually,
became
one
an
thing did leave, but not that.
I think yes, because you developed something that. Oh well, what did leave?
It wasn't something something I used. It was one of the things they did at Livermore. Well, they got to 6600 while I was working on the Stretch. They got to 6600, and there were a few time-sharing systems people had tried at that point. So Bob Abbott was one of the guys out there, and a few programmers got together and wrote a time-sharing system. Norm helped them a lot because he had been familiar with CTSS, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so he helped them with the design a lot, and they wrote a time-sharing system for the 6600. And so we all got teletypes on our desks and got to use the time-sharing system. And it turned out that is the one thing, the time-sharing system, that they actually exported to Los Alamos. That was Los Alamos didn't take anything else from Livermore, but they did take the time-sharing system.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so you became a Livermore employee then,
Yes.
rather than IBM. Okay.
Yeah.
And you already had the necessary security clearance?
No, they
I
had to
guess?
do it
Oh,
again.
because you needed the Q thing, or
Something
for the nuclear secrets, I
something.
imagine.
Yeah, there was something weird about it. So I had to go
Yeah.
through it all again. And at Livermore, I guess they had started earlier. Well, they knew we were going to need NSA clearance. So they started us through the clearance process while we were still writing the Fortran compiler. But Livermore, I just showed up. So they couldn't really have me do anything until I had the clearance, because they couldn't get inside the gate.
Oh,
And
geez.
it turned out there were three other guys, me and three guys, who were getting our clearance at the same time. And so it took about 6 months. We spent 6 months playing bridge outside the gate. Every time my friends ask me, why don't you join our bridge club? I say, I spent 8 hours a day, 6 months playing bridge with these guys. I'm never going to play bridge again.
Did you had to actually go up to Livermore and sit in an office building outside of the?
Outside the gate.
Like in the visitor area or
Yeah.
something?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh.
So that was, it wasn't quite that bad. They let us, I guess, by the last month, they really wanted this Fortran compiler. And so they let me in, but I had a guard with me every minute I was inside the gate. And the really funny thing about this is that, of course, I would compile, I would get a listing, compile on the Stretch, get a listing, and all the listings that come off the computers inside the fence have this trim on the edge that say classified information. And you're not supposed to look at anything that says classified information until you have your clearance. So the guard would have to come along and tear off the edge so I could look at the
Like the perforated edge or whatever?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. They must have really wanted that compiler. Yeah.
So it's really crazy, yeah.
But, I mean,
There was nothing else on the computer. It isn't that I could have taken anything, because they cleaned the computer, in between users. It's all yours. There's nothing else. Nobody else's.
So it's essentially
It's a bare
wiped
machine.
clean.
It's clean. There's a bare
There's
machine.
nothing there.
There's nothing there. So
Isn't that interesting?
yeah, but they still had to go through. They still had the guard.
Was there Was that done through software or hardware? That reinitializing of the machine?
Oh,
Or
you
was that
load
its
in
nature?
you just walk up to the machine, you put your cards in the card reader, it reads them in, does the processing, you get your printout, and basically the machines, I guess if you were really clever, you could write a program that would read what the previous user had put there. But,
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
but it would have been complicated.
Yes. Well, had you played bridge before that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you weren't, and then were you playing contract bridge and?
I was just playing regular friendly
Okay.
bridge.
Okay. Yeah.
And this was just friendly bridge.
Yeah.
And the other guys, we all stayed friends, in spite of the fact that we all played bridge.
And did you continue to play bridge afterward,
No.
or did it cure you
That
of
cured
that?
me.
Yeah, yeah.
Programming was more fun,
Right. Well, could you describe, once everything was all said and you could just be a regular
Yeah.
employee, could you talk about the software group there around Stretch and just what it was like to do your work?
It was computation at that time was a very good group at, a division at the lab, and Sid Fernbach was the manager and well-known. And Sid sort of made it his job to get the first of every computer that ever came out. So it was a great place to be because you had everybody around you was working on a brand new computer, and they were fun and interesting. And computation was a really good place to work. It was back. It was a government, so it was there were many fewer gender issues
In government?
in government. Government, yeah. The law didn't come in until '64, but the non-discrimination law. But the government was trying out some of these laws earlier than that. They really did try to have a better gender balance, and they were just. If you were managing a group, which I did for a while, then I really was making more than the people working for me. Unlike IBM, which was just totally out nowhere. So there were many fewer gender issues in Livermore. I shared an office with a woman named Barbara Schell, who I'm still friends with. And actually, she came to work for me over at Tymshare years later. So. Yeah, so we got teletypes on our desk and got to use this time-sharing system. I wrote the editor for the 6600, which they used for many years, and I wrote the Lisp compiler for the 6600, and part of the PL1 compiler. I don't think we ever quite finished it, but it was. But it was fun, we got to try all these different things. And of course, once you've used a time-sharing system, you never want to go back. This business of carrying your cards down to the computer, risking dropping cards, which people, everybody does once in a while, carrying them back up, and then waiting for, 24 hours before you get another shot. And it's like, once you use a time-sharing system, you never want to go back.
I had written down, I was wondering if it was something of like a epiphany or a conversion experience, that time sharing is so superior in all aspects.
It is. And we've never had a choice before.
Right.
This was a very early try at time sharing, and it had some limitations, but it was so much better than anything else any of us had ever worked on. That once you try that, going back is not not likely.
Was there, because, I mean, this, correct me if I'm wrong, this seems to me a very early time-sharing system.
Very.
Was there kind of a buzz in your computation group about it? That,
Oh, yeah.
you know, that this is the future of computing, or?
Well, I don't know that, well, there was in the group that wrote it, and among those of us who did system programming, yes, but a lot of the people, computation was mostly system programming and was interested in time sharing, but not everybody. And most of the programmers in Livermore are doing science programming, you know, they're modeling.
Yeah.
And so, of course, time sharing is better for them too, but their focus is on scientific programming and modeling what happens when you blow up the world.
Right. So it may have been, right, their focus is, they may have enjoyed using time sharing to build their models and simulations, but
right.
their intent is on the model.
Their intent is the model,
Yeah.
right. And that's okay. Yeah.